Some key points regarding species and speciation. According to the biological species concept, organisms belong to the same species if they can interbreed to produce viable fertile offspring. Species are separated from one another by prezygotic and postzygotic barriers, which prevent mating or production of viable fertile offspring. Speciation is the process by which new species form. It occurs when groups in the species become reproductively isolated and damaged. In allotropic speciation, groups from an ancestral population evolve into separate species due to a period of geographical separation. In sympatric speciation, groups from the same ancestral population evolve into separate species without any geographical separation. What really makes a species a species? Organisms that look alike often belong to the same species, but this isn't always the case. One can't tell the African fish eagle and the bald eagle apart from the photos below, but they are in fact different species. Organisms that belong to the same species can look very different from one another. For instance, dogs come in all shapes and sizes, from tiny chihuahuas to massive Great Danes, but they belong to same species, Canis familiaris, the domestic dog. So we can say that appearances doesn't really define a species. Scientists tend to define a species based on reproductive compatibility. That is, organisms are usually considered to be a member of same species if they can successfully reproduce with another. Now let us discuss the biological species concept. According to the most widely used species definition, the biological species concept, a species is a group of organisms that can potentially interbreed or mate with another to produce viable fertile offspring. In these definitions, members of the same species must have potential to interbreed. However, that doesn't mean they have to be part of same interbreeding group in real life. For instance, a group of dogs living in America or Australia or a group of dogs living in Africa are unlikely to mate, but could have puppies if they did. In order to be considered to be a single species in the biological species concept, a group of organisms must produce healthy, fertile offspring when they interbreed. In some cases, organisms of different species can mate and produce healthy offspring, but the offspring are infertile and can't reproduce. For example, when a female horse and a male donkey mate, they produce hybrid offspring called mules. Although mule picture below is perfectly healthy and often left to reap old age, it is infertile and can't have its own offspring. Because of this, we consider horse and donkey different species. The biological species concept connects the idea of a species to the process of evolution. Because members of a species can interbreed, the species as a whole has a common gene pool, a collection of gene variants. On the other hand, genes are not exchanged between different species. Even if organisms of different species combine the DNA to make offspring, the offspring will be sterile, unable to pass on their genes. Because of this restricted gene flow, each species evolves as a group of distinct species from another one. Now let us learn what keeps species distinct. The biological species concept defines organisms as being or not being of same species based on whether they can interbreed to make fertile offspring. Broadly speaking, different species are unable to interbreed and produce healthy fertile offspring due to barrier or mechanisms of reproductive isolation. These barriers can be split into two categories based on what they are: prezygotic and postzygotic. Now let us first discuss about prezygotic barriers. Prezygotic barriers prevent members of different species from mating to produce a zygote, a single-cell embryo. Some example scenarios are below. Two species might prefer different habitats and thus be unlikely to encounter one another. This is called habitat isolation. Let's take an example. The two cricket species below prefer to live in different environments. The sandy soil in disturbed areas and loamy and nasal soil at the edge of forest, which contributes to the reproductive isolation. Now let us discuss our second scenario. Two species might reproduce at different times of a day or year and thus be unlikely to meet up when seeking mates. This is called temporal isolation. Two frog species below are reproductively isolated because the frog on the left reproduces earlier in the year than the frog on the right. Now let us discuss third scenario. Two species might have different courtship method or mate preferences and thus find each other unattractive. This is known as behavioral isolation. For example, this can be as tiny as slight difference in the songs sung by males of two classes of a species, which females of each species are attracted only to songs of their own species. Worst scenario, two species might produce egg and sperm cells that can't combine in fertilization, even if they meet up through mating. This is known as gametic isolation. For example, coral species releases eggs and sperm into the water en masse for fertilization, but gamete incompatibility prevents certain crossover hybrids from forming. Fifth scenario, two species might have bodies or reproductive structures that simply doesn't fit together. This is called mechanical isolation. For example, the male reproductive organs of greater species of damselfly shown below have distinctive shape. Each enables the male to mate only with the female of its own species. Now let us discuss about post-zygotic barriers. Post-zygotic barriers give hybrid zygotes, one-celled embryos with parents of two different species from developing into healthy fertile adults. Post-zygotic barriers are often related to the hybrid embryo's mixed set of chromosomes, which may not match up correctly or carry a complete set of information. In some cases, the chromosomal mismatch is lethal to the embryo or results in the individual that can survive but is unhealthy. In other cases, a hybrid can survive to adulthood in good condition but is infertile because it can't split its mismatched chromosomes evenly into eggs or sperm. For example, this type of mismatch explains why mules are sterile and unable to reproduce.
How do new species arise? For speciations to occur, two new populations must be formed from new original population, and they must evolve in such a way that it becomes impossible for individuals from the two new populations to interbreed. New species arise through a process called a speciation. In speciations, an ancestral species splits into two or more descendant species that are genetically different from the another and can no longer interbreed. Biologists often divide the way the speciation can occur into two broad categories. Allopatric speciation, allo meaning other and patric meaning homeland, involves geographic separation of population from a parent species and subsequent evolution. Sympatric species, sims means same and patric meaning homeland, involves speciation occurring within a parent species remaining in one location. Allopatric speciation. In allopatric speciation, organism of an ancestral species will evolve into two or more descendant species after a period of physical separation caused by a geographic barrier such as a mountain range, rock slide or river. Sometimes barriers such as a lava flow splits population by changing the landscape. Other times populations become separated after some members cross a pre-existing barrier. For example, members of a mainland population may become isolated on an island if they fall over on places of debris. Once the group are reproductively isolated, they may undergo genetic divergence, that is, they may gradually become more and more different in their genetic makeup and heritable feature of our many generation. Genetic divergence happens because of natural selection, which may favor different traits in each environment and other evolutionary force like genetic drift. As they diverge, the group may evolve traits that act as prezygotic and postzygotic barrier to reproduction. For instance, if one group evolves large body size and the other evolves small body size, the organism may not be physically able to meet a prezygotic barrier if the population are reunited. If the reproductive barriers that have arise are strong, effectively preventing gene flow, the groups will keep evolving along separate paths, that is, they won't exchange genes with one another even if the geographical barriers is removed. At this point, the group can be considered spared species. Case study. Squirrels and the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon was gradually carved out the Colorado River over millions of years before it formed. Only one species of squirrels inhabited the area. As the canyon got deeper over time, it became increasingly difficult for squirrels to travel between the north and south sides. Eventually, the canyon became too deep for the squirrels to cross, and a subgroup of squirrels became isolated on each side. Because the squirrels on the north and south sides were reproductively isolated from one another due to the deep canyon barrier, they eventually diverged into different species. Sympatric speciation. In sympatric speciation, organisms from the same ancestral species become reproductively isolated and diverge without any physical separation. Summary. The biological species concept defines a species as a group of individuals living in one or more populations that can potentially interbreed to produce healthy, fertile offspring. Other species concepts exist and may be more useful for certain type of organism. New species from bispeciation, in which an ancestral population splits into two or more genetically distinct descended populations. Speciation involves reproductive isolation of groups within the original population and accumulation of genetic difference between the two groups. In allopatric speciation, groups become reproductively isolated and diverge due to a geographical barrier. In sympatric speciation, reproductive isolation and divergence occurs without geographical barriers, from example by polyploidy.